Good morning, everyone. Today's theme, as you can see, is another place that we all miss and we all want to come back to reality and enjoy properly, which is the beach. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that at some point in the future. All right. Today, we will talk about the theory of constructivism. Before that, as always, let's do a quick review of our discussion on Tuesday. So I talked about rational choice, a general theory of behavior. What is rational choice? The basic principles of the theory. A basic, very simple understanding or a simple framework to explain the way that we behave, a very purposeful type of behavior intended to maximize different objectives. The different assumption of the theory regarding preferences, regarding the unitary actor. And then we went a little bit deeper into how do we apply this kind of theory. Again, it's not a theory of IR, as in a tool which allows us to define different theories of IR. But how do we apply that to one of the most important questions we can think about in the context of international relations, which is the study of war. The question of whether war is a rational choice. Why is it a rational choice? What is not a rational choice? According to the paper presented by, introduced by Fearon, way back in the mid-1990s. He focused his discussion around what he termed the bargaining range, why rational actors should be able to locate peaceful settlement and not go into a conflict. And then he proposed different types of explanations, which he termed rationalist, which means that when there is a rational choice, remind you again, war should not be the outcome. But we can explain, we can rationalize the behavior of actors getting into war and explain that based on those two explanations he offered. He talked about three. I focused on two. The first one was the private information. Having private information and having incentives to misrepresent this private information can lead to miscalculations and going to war. And then the discussion about commitment problem, the fact that the international system does not have a central authority to enforce all agreements. So powerful actors have incentives to renege on agreement and try to take advantage of their counterparts. How that may lead to war, how that may actually lead to preventative wars was the main discussion in the Fearon context. And then we focused on this specific explanation of commitment problem in the context of extended nuclear deterrence using the Furman and Sesher study. They focused on how nuclear powers, which try to exert their deterring power, are actually facing a commitment problem, because the question is for those rivals of the local protege in which the nuclear powers are trying to protect, whether they will view the nuclear powers as committed to come to the defense of those states. So again, the example in which I use throughout most of the discussion was the United States along with South Korea and North Korea. Do the North Koreans believe that the Americans will invest resources into a conflict because they have a defense agreement with South Korea? And then the focus was whether you need actually to use just a costly signal in terms of making a defense pact public, which has reputational and credibility cost, or you actually need to deploy troops in order to prevent attacks. Based on their data, what they showed mostly that a public defense pact or a public defense agreement is an important and a powerful costly signal, which reduces the likelihood of those countries getting into war, and actually deploying troops is not a very efficient in preventing conflict. So that was this discussion. If you have any questions in this context, of course, you are more than welcome to email me or come talk to me over office hours during the week. So I want to go to our topic of today. After talking about rational choice, we will address the framework of constructivism. This is a framework which fits both the description of an analytic tool, but it talks about a lot of the aspects that are related to IR and the elements of IR, which we'll get to that, and making a lot of the proponents of the constructivist framework describe it as actually a theory of IR. So let's start talking about that. So first of all, this is an approach which represents a stark contrast to the rational choice framework. In many of the existing theories of realism, liberalism, and all those class of theories. All those theories that we talked about so far assume that every actor or nation state has certain objectives, and the behavior is intended to maximize those objectives. For neoliberalism, it was maximizing security. For liberalism, it was maximizing wealth or maximizing cooperation. Constructivism, on the other hand, has a different view. Constructivism focuses on explaining how those objectives are actually formed, how they are constructed, or how they may change. So this is a more basic process element of how those objectives are formed. And the theory details the different elements that drive the formation of those goals, and we'll get to that. It introduces a natural link between domestic culture, as well as some of aspects as personal values or shared values and the preferences of the members of society, along with the more international relations theory concepts such as power and hierarchy and anarchy. And that's how this links those two things together. One of the prominent aspects of the theory of constructivism is the formation of identity, how we see ourselves. And our identity in that case, and that's how it trickles actually into the behavior of the state and into behavior in the international context, is that our identity also reflects our preferences. And our preferences and our identity is a function of three different processes: legitimation, role definition, and reflection. And to explain exactly how those three processes operate, I'm going to use an example. That example is going to be related to human rights. So for example, some countries may decide to endorse and then sign a human rights treaty, even if this specific country actually violates those kinds of rights, those kinds of norms internally. So we do not accept, we do not follow or do not respect human rights in our country, but we are actually signing, the leader of our country, whatever country that is, signs an international agreement related to human rights. The motivation, especially at the first, in the earlier stages, is mostly strategic for that leader, because he or she wants to become accepted and legitimate in the eyes of the international community, so they're willing to sign that agreement. According to the constructivist perspective, as leaders engage in this rhetorical endorsement of the treaty, they begin facing international pressure from different groups that support those kinds of norms, that it needs to be accepted, needs to be adopted a lot more wildly. And the constructivist view calls for the change, the shift in the behavior, because the international pressure, as well as their own language that the leaders are using in order to endorse this kind of treaty, even if they don't believe it in the first place, leads to the eventual shift in behavior, to the persuasion of those leaders that they should alter their behavior and respect that norm of human rights in this context, both externally, in terms of the external affairs, as well as internally. This is the process of that has to go through. This kind of change represents, according to the constructivist theory, the phases of role definition and reflections as leaders or actors shift their support to a socially accepted global norm, even though their initial motivation to accept this kind of norm was mostly strategic and was intended to escape criticism. Now I want to talk about some of the main elements of the theory of constructivism. What you're going to hear me talk about now, see me talk about now, is many of the different elements that we saw in other IR theories. And they're giving a little bit of a different interpretation under this prism of constructivist views. So first is actors, international actors, which operate within structures. So we talked about all those different elements within realism, neorealism, liberalism, all the other theories. According to the constructivist view, any action in the international system is only possible within what's called an intersubjective social context. So different actors interact and develop relationship with others based on various norms And without those norms, which serve as the foundations for their relationship, then those actions have no meaning. That's the idea of interactions between different actors within the structure. Now, before going any further, probably you want to stop yourself and says, well, what is this intersubjectivity or intersubjective social concept referred to? Well, this is one of the central concepts in the theory of constructivist view. And this is kind of some illustration to provide an explanation of what is exactly social intersubjectivity. This is the concept that refers to an agreement, or in this case, a shared view. So it's not a verbal agreement, it's not an official agreement, it's usually a non-official agreement, or mostly a shared view by multiple individuals, 2 or more individuals, about the way to interpret or to understand the meaning of a situation. Some of the scholars in this literature call it sharing of subjective states by 2 or more individuals. So idea here, so as you can see, what it has here is it is based on a verbal or non-verbal communications about accepting certain situations and viewing them similarly. That's the idea of intersubjectivity, this intersubjectivity in the social context. Now, in essence, what it means is that individuals who may have subjective views of different situations actually share a view of a certain scenario or a certain situation. Now, this shared view, this intersubjective interpretation of the situation is driven by the existence of shared norms and shared values by those individuals, by those groups, societal groups. As an example, now, before I'm going to the US example, you already see it on the screen. When I talked about shared norms in the context, especially of liberalism, this was the previous lecture that we talked a little bit about norms and the diffusion of norms. It was mostly viewed as positive norms or the diffusion of positive shared norms among society. Now, again, one interpretation that constructivists provide to those, we don't have to think about it just as the diffusion of norms which have to promote cooperation. And that's exactly what this example is talking about. Because the US in the Vietnam War had the identity of a great power. And in this case, in order to interpret it, the action is that the acts of a military intervention, according to a constructivist view, was intended to demonstrate this specific identity. Again, the identity of a great power. So what proponents of the theory will present, the way that they will describe the American decision to go into the Vietnam conflict, is that the US intervention in Vietnam perpetuated the international intersubjective understanding of great powers as those states. So this is what great power is. This is the identity of great power. And this is what a great power does, in this case, using military power against others. This is the interpretation of this type of behavior. Another central element in IR theories is identities and interests. Again, we talked about it mostly in the context of liberalism. We also talked about interest, of course, with respect to all the material theories. So identities are a crucial component of the global system. They generate expectations about the behavior. So based on our identities, we can expect to understand the behavior of others, and others can expect to understand our behavior. And without it, according to the constructivist view, the world involves a lot more chaos and uncertainty. And that chaos is even worse than the anarchy described by the neorealist view, because you can never understand or interpret the behavior of others without understanding their identities. Now, identity has a very important norm in this context, because identities are intended to inform others on different interests, on different preferences that I have, as well as the different actions that I'm taking with respect to certain domains or certain contexts. So by those other actors understanding what is my identity, they're also able to interpret it, what are my interests, what are my preferences, and to understand my actions. Now, this intersubjective view of identity impacts the way that I view others and the way that others view myself. But the fact that I have some identity does not mean that I necessarily have control on the way that others will interpret my identity. And this is the example here of the Soviets and the Russia. So during the Cold War, according to a lot of the constructivist theories, many of the Slavic nations, which are countries on the periphery of Russia, they were part of the Soviet Union, they still viewed the Soviet Union as Russia, which is the historic Russia. So despite the fact that the Soviet government have made very strong efforts or attempts to change that perspective. So the identity of the Soviets as Russians remained in the eyes of others, even though they made a lot of attempts to change that identity to be viewed as Soviets, as large, great power, all those things that, like the example I gave you with the United States and Vietnam, they tried to change or to alter their identity as a global power, which is not viewed just as small Russia in the case, if you can think about it as a small, but they were unable to change that perception with the way that other countries have viewed them. So this is in the sense of the view of identity. Power is another important concept, of course, in other IR theories as well as in constructivism. It is viewed not just in the sense of material power, but also as an important aspect of a discourse. The discussion among different actors is based a lot on on power. The focus in this case is on different actions that involve power and are exhibited with the intention of reproducing or producing intersubjective meaning within a social structure, which is a very complicated sentence. And let's take an example to try and understand that. So the example again brings us back to the Americans during the Vietnam War. So the American actions in Vietnam, according to that view, again, focusing on the idea of power, were intended to reproduce or expand multiple identities that the Americans had. Some of them they liked more, some of them they liked less. So for example, a lot of the Americans were very supportive of the great power identity during that time, maybe not as much supported or liked the identity of an imperialist nation. It was viewed by many countries in the world. But the actions in this case, and again, linking it back to the concept of power, those actions were military actions, were intended to expand and exhibit those kinds of identities. That's the idea of power within the context of the constructivist view. What I talked about so far is the common conventional view of constructivism. I'm just putting it aside, just giving it something that you can think about if that's something that's interested you. There is another version of constructivism, which is a lot more critical. If you want to know more about the critical version of constructivism, you're more than welcome to send me an email and ask me. I can send you some stuff about that. This critical version of constructivism has a lot of similarities with postmodern critical approaches, which I'm not a big fan of. And that's not the reason I'm not talking about it, because I don't want to spend the entire time talking about the different versions of constructivism in this case, but a lot of that version of constructivism fits with those postmodern critical theories. So if you are interested in that, you're more than welcome to send me an email and I will send you some things to read about. Okay. So I talked about some of the main elements of the constructivist theory, or the way that the constructivist theory interprets some of the main elements of the IR theory we talked about so far. I want to talk a little bit more now about some of the main topics of international relations and the way that they are described within the constructivist framework. So first is the idea of balance of threats, balance of capabilities, balance of power, all those things we talked about within the material family of theories, the realist theories. According to neorealism, of course, as I've already talked about, balancing behavior is intended to oppose a growing threat from strong actors which have hostile intentions. Now, constructivist view, again, as I tell you, talks a little bit about the process to understanding where these concepts are coming from, So they're actually arguing that we need to focus instead on the constructions of those threats or those intentions on the a priori stage of them. So how exactly do we get to the fact that strong states, the behavior of strong states represents a hostile intention? So that means we have to focus on threat perception. So balancing in this case, we need to focus not necessarily on the material capabilities of nations. So because they have strong material capabilities, we need to balance against them. Instead, we have to seek the shared or the common identities among different nation states, and that's going to help us understand the formation of the balancing behavior of different states. So for example, we can think about it in the context of the Cold War and the creation of the different Cold War blocks. So instead of viewing them as two blocks of strategic blocks that were based on a power interest or security interest or distribution of capabilities in this case, we can view the formation of the East-West bloc during the Cold War as based on the shared identities of some of those countries. For example, many of the Western European countries had a lot of similarities in their identities with the United States, as well as the Eastern European countries or some of the Eastern Asian country along with the Soviet Union. So that's a different interpretation for the creations of those blocks. So it wasn't intended just as a balancing in the context of national security and power. It was actually based on the fact that there were shared identities between many of members on one block and the same thing in the other block. So that's one interpretation of the constructivist view. Cooperation is another topic which I talked about at length, especially in the context of liberalism. Liberal theory promotes cooperation based on different factors, which the common denominator for most of them is the idea of promoting self-interest, whether it was repeated interactions, whether it is ensuring our own wealth, but all of them are focused on the self-interest of the individual. On the other hand, a constructivist view is different, and the emphasis is not on the distribution of interest or the distribution of power like we had in the context of neorealism. It is actually the distribution of identities and the effect that there's similar identities among different actors which lead to their cooperation. So some shared identity among different actors will increase the likelihood that these two nations will actually cooperate with one another, mostly because the focus is on reducing the incentives for unilateral action, instead focusing more on a cooperation. So the cooperation is not just based on materialist elements or material self-interest, it's actually the promotion of actual discourse among those different nations in order to drive cooperation, which will accomplish a real goal, a real value. It's not just material self-interest, it is a shared value of those two or more actors which drive their cooperation based on the discourse and intended to finding this real value. Finally, talking about domestic politics. So again, constructivism is presented as a general theory similar to realism, neorealism, liberalism. Has to be a structure type theory focusing on the international system and how the international system affects the behavior of different individuals. But constructivism as a theory allows a lot more room for different internal dynamics, including culture, including society. And it views, and this I already mentioned that when I talked about the definition of some of the definitions within the constructivism, is that the identity of every actor within the international system is actually an outcome of the different social practices that constitute those actions, those kinds of identities back at home. And as a result, those internal dynamics that happen within the state itself serve both as a constraint as well as sometimes enable the state's identity, the state's interest, and the state's action in the international system. So again, this is a lot more room provided for internal dynamics and how those different dynamics within the domestic environment affect the identity in this case, which by itself affect the behavior on the international scale. And I'll give you an example to make it a little bit clearer. And the example for us using another imperialist power in the last 200 years. So the British occupation of India can be viewed in material terms, thinking about this in the neoliberalist view, thinking about it as the expansion of British power, thinking about it even as the expansion of British wealth. This is one way. According to a constructivist view of this behavior by the British during that time, we have to think about the role of imperialist identities. Now, those imperialist identities are identities which are more prevalent in the international system, right? Because imperialism is less prevalent within the domestic context of Great Britain. But the imperialist identity is based on some of the domestic identities or the domestic interactions within Britain itself. In this case, one argument can be that those imperialist identities are based on age-based generational identities or gender identities within Britain. So that's different age groups, young versus old, and the way that those two groups within society interact among one another. Males and females, of course, is a very important identity that many countries have. So if we take those identities and we extrapolate them to the imperialist identity and the actions of the British in the international system, the British are viewed as the masculine male, and India in that case is viewed as the female, the submissive female, which accepts the external control over it. That's the way that an internal identity, internal dynamics within the state actually impact the external identity of the state, and then by that it also affects the behavior of the state in the international system. Now I want to talk about how the constructivism, as you can see from everything that I've talked about so far, it is a little bit more complicated to understand the ideas behind the constructivist theory. And that's why I want to spend the rest of the lectures that I have so far to see how that fits within the framework of an IR research. So first, let's address some of the main distinctions between constructivism and most of the material theories of IR. So the fact that identities, which is one of the central concepts of constructivist theories, are viewed in an intersubjective manner, part of the definition of constructivism, means that the identity of some nations may be viewed differently by external actors. What all that means is that states are no longer viewed, according to constructivism, as a unitary actor. Not all states appear the same to everyone. Again, the way that the identity is viewed by others can be different among different actors in the international system, which means it is no longer a unitary actor assumption in this case. Neorealism promotes, of course, and is based on the assumption of self-interest and self-help, right? Because of the anarchy in the international system. So self-help is a central concept. Now, according to the constructivist view, the assumption of self-help is only possible if we ignored the fact that different interests that every state has are the outcome of different social practices that lead to those different interests and those different actors. So interest of a state, the interest of the state, and in this case, that leads to the self-interest, which is central in material theories, are formed within the process of identity formation. So the formation of identity, which are internal to the different actors, those are leading to the formation of different interests, and that can lead to the self-interest assumption aspect of material theories. In addition, power in the context of constructivism is not just material, it also is very important in the context of discourse. So a lot of the discourse is based on a power concept. I've already mentioned the idea that actors and structures constitute each other. So actors are actually formed based on those different identities, and then they shape the structures within which they behave, they act. And finally, according to constructivist theory, change is possible. Change in the system is possible, yet it's hard. Now, material theories and like neorealism and realism also talk about the idea of change in the system, but they don't talk a lot about changes in the possibility of actually the system to change. And that's one of the things I'll take you back to the discussion about the realist theory and the neorealist theory, the fact that a lot of the behavior in the international context is very, very predictable because of the way that the system is structured makes the behavior of actors very, very predictable in the sense. Now, according to the constructivism, change of the system is very, very hard, but it is possible. So that's another difference. Yet, there are some similarities between realist theories and constructivist theory, which again fits it back into the idea that constructivism can be viewed by some as a general theory or as an IR theory in this case. And I don't know about general theory, but as an IR theory. Both types of theories have a fundamental concern with the role of the structure, as well as the role of anarchy in more politics. Both material theories as well as constructivism care about the definition of state interest, how those state interests are defined, those very different definitions of how those state interests are formed, but both of those classes of theories, both material theories as well as IR theories, as well as the constructivist theories, deal with that. And lastly, both those theories deal with the concept of power and the prospects for change in the international system. Some of the main challenges and limitations of this framework. The first question, and that goes back to the topic that I began with in this, that I started with in this discussion, is whether constructivism is better viewed as a theory, an IR theory, or just another analytic framework which can be used in order to generate different theories, just the way that I talked about on rational choice theory on Tuesday. So some of the critics of the constructivist view suggest that the focus on internal aspects such as culture, such as values, such as identity, cannot come instead of actually proposing a stated theory of politics, which means, according to those critics, that constructivism is better fit to the description of analytic tools because it focuses on the process and it does not offer necessarily substantive outcomes. So it provides us an explanation on the process leading to some outcomes, but it doesn't have clear prediction about those outcomes. The focus on the process, meaning that this is better defined as an analytic tool instead of a theory. The second challenge that constructivist theories face is the idea of empirical testing. Finding evidence to support these kinds of conjectures is very, very hard. Even finding evidence and designing different research studies to test those theories is very, very complicated. We need to collect large amounts of data to understand what are some of those concepts. For example, what is an identity? We need a lot of data to understand what is that, what exactly it is this concept. Some of this data is what's called primary data, which means we have to go and do interviews with individuals. We have to do very extended archival research, which again means we have to do a lot of work in order to just understand what are those concepts are and then test them in an empirical sense, which makes it very, very challenging in this case of fitting the constructivist framework into a scientific framework. Many empirical studies, existing empirical studies or tests of constructivism suffer from selection bias. I've mentioned selection bias already when I talked about it in the first lecture, which means that instead of selecting cases and taking a list of cases, randomly assigning those cases and testing whether the different independent variable in the context of constructivism, that may be norms, that may be values, that may be the process of persuasion, whether those factors actually from a systematic standpoint lead to any kind of predicted outcome. What many of those scholars of constructivists, especially the ones who are engaging in empirical testing, do is that they engage in selection bias, which means that they're using cases in which the dependent variable that they're testing supports the logic, and they do not account for cases in which the outcome does not support the logic of the theory. I talked about selection bias beforehand. In terms of the actual scientific evidence, which has to be, cannot fit this selection bias concept, it's a lot harder to find support for this theory. Let's take an example in this case. So one of the international treaties is the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It includes provisions related to respecting human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and respecting due process. It was approved in 1966, signed by many or even most members of the United Nations. The paradox in this case is that many of those states actually violate those rights or those norms within their own borders. That includes countries such as China, North Korea, Iran. Those are some of the countries that signed that treaty. Proponents of the theory of the constructivist theory will argue that these states have signed the treaty, the UN International Covenant, and they are still in the earlier phase of legitimation. And this is a long process which will take time to materialize. And that on some level fits with the example that I gave you at the beginning of the lecture today, that the motivation is strategic, and over time, maybe the leaders of those countries will actually be persuaded by some of the norms behind those kinds of agreement, and they would change their behavior. However, there's a study from 2010 study tested whether the signing on the human rights treaties, which means that those countries are liable to international pressure, actually lead to a change in behavior, especially among dictatorships. And that specific study did not find support. Now, we cannot necessarily put a lot of criticism on that specific study because it surveyed a 15-year period, which means if supporters of the constructivist theory will argue that this is a long process, that paper, that 2010 paper, which did not find support for signing a human rights treaty on the change on behavior, looked at a pretty much a long span of time, 15 years period, and still could not find support for the theory's prediction, which again, it's part of the problems that constructivism is facing in the context of empirical support. Another example in this case is Saudi Arabia. In 2018, Saudi Arabia lifted its long-standing ban on women driving. And using the constructivist approach, we can view that action as a sign of accepting the norm and the possibility of change. But it is still very, very much in question, because even if it is fitting this constructivist viewpoint, it is still very minor. And there's a lot of human rights that are still being violated in Saudi Arabia. Another reason why we should still question this argument is that the main reason the monarchy gave for accepting this kind of action is their need to modernize the economy and attract foreign investment. So the motivation was not based on accepting some kind of norm in the context of human rights. It was actually very material in that case. Now, if you want to read a little bit more about the Saudi Arabia story, whether this actually is a progress or not, then I would recommend you to press the link here. This is I can show you that here. Just a minute. Do that. There it is. This is a story from ABC from last year, 2019. talking a little bit about whether this change in the rule regarding women driving actually reflects any kind of accepting of a new norm related to human rights in Saudi Arabia, or just like we talked about so far, it's actually much more materialist in nature. So this you can just press this link on the slides once you view them, and you can read the story there. Okay, so change according to constructivism is a long process, which means accepting global norms, which by themselves push for gradual change in behavior. Now, I want to talk about this process and how it actually is materialized in reality with one application, using the paper, another paper that you had to read for today, related to the issues of LGBT rights in Uganda. So the authors discuss the concept, the topic of LGBT rights and the government action in Uganda. They present some of the concepts, including norm immunization, as well as norm backlash. The idea behind norm immunization is a set of barriers or instruments created by the government, in this case, the Uganda government, in order to resist transnational norms from further diffusing, from further internalizing into the domestic society. And those instruments, which I will talk in detail in a few minutes, are focusing on blocking the capabilities of local actors to advocate for the acceptance of those norms. The paper discusses how the diffusion or the expansion of global norms actually create the opposite effect with the government action of norm backlash. And why is this called a backlash? When transnational groups or advocates pressure local governments to accept certain norms which are accepted in the global sense, such as different human rights, it turns those norms into a lot more salient topics of discussion in the local setting. When the government is not willing to accept that, when the government is concerned about internal pressure from the local population regarding those kinds of norms, then the external pressure in that context actually pushes the government to promote its own type of discourse. Again, discourse is a very important concept in the context of constructivism. Now, this discourse revolving around constructing this specific transnational norm is actually a threat to the country, which requires defensive regulations against this kind of threat. And this is the background for the creation of those legal barriers. And the focus of those legal barriers is not necessarily the norm itself, it's actually the advocacy of the norm. And the immunization process, the focus of the process is to undermine the preconditions of internalizing the norms within the country. Therefore, it reduces the vulnerability of the state to the diffusion of this transnational norm. Before going into the Uganda case, this is not unique to Uganda. So this Uganda, this is a couple of examples from across the world. So in 2006, one of the regional parliaments in Russia accepted a set of legal actions against the promotion of what's called non-traditional sexual relations, which again speaks to different rights for the members of the LGBT community. In 2013, this set of legal actions were adopted as a federal law in Russia. Similar laws were accepted in other countries such as Algeria and Nigeria in 2014. And for the vast majority of those countries which adopted these kind of laws, the justification that they proposed was that we need to protect children from this idea of promoting the non-traditional sexual relations and non-traditional relationship among individuals. So this is something which is not unique to Uganda. It has happened in other states, in other places in the world. Focusing a little bit of the concept of norms backlash. So research has already proposed this possibility that a strong diffusion of transnational norms will actually create the possibility of a backlash because of both internal as well as international pressure on the government. This kind of opposition is more likely when the norm presents a political threat to the government, and also the diffusion of the norm follows a successful local advocacy for the norm. So when local groups or locals, members of the country are beginning to advocate to the more wide-scale acceptance of those norms, then it's viewed as a threat to the government, and it's more likely to generate this backlash. As an example, we can think about Japan and the whaling industry. The growth of a global opposition to the hunting of whales have led to extensive international pressure on Japan, and that in turn led to a backlash in the form of a Japanese campaign against this anti-whaling pressure. And it was mostly constructed within Japan as a threat on the Japanese identity. So this international pressure against whaling was described within Japan as a threat to the identity of the Japanese people, and that's how it created the backlash. The backlash is defined or is viewed as a regressive action which is intended to counter the process of internalizing the norm itself. And in both cases, it is focusing on constructing or framing the norm as a national threat. And I'll get to that in a second. There's different types of actions that can be taken as part of this norms backlash. So there are diverse actions can be taken. Some of them may focus or target the content of the norm. For example, there is attacks against gays in Iraq. This is one category of actions. There can be actions intended to focus on the advocacy itself. So in Nigeria, there was some laws that were introduced forbidding the registration of gay clubs. Actions may be in the form of laws, such as the amendment of the Texas Constitution regarding the definition of marriage. And some of them can be more policy focused. For example, the state-controlled media in Iraq, which was pushed to begin a campaign of propaganda against gay men. So those are just different types of actions that government can take, focusing on different elements of those norms as part of this backlash against the diffusion of international and transnational norms. Before I go into the case itself, I will stop for today's attendance word. The attendance word for today is so long. So long is our attendance word. And now we can move on to Uganda. So I will talk about the Uganda case in the different stages, which include the actual diffusion of the norm and the response from the government. So the first stage in this process is defined as a transnational norm advocacy. In the 1980s, several international organizations began advocating for the protection of gay rights. During that time, some of those organizations were able to achieve legal victories in some of legal battles in Europe. This extent of global support for the norm, which can be described or defined as a diffusion of the norm in the global sense, reached its high level that it is today, and it's adopted mostly in the West. At the same time, it faced strong opposition by different religious groups, as well as different nations. Some of those nations included Russia, Egypt, and others. The second phase of this process, focusing on Uganda itself, is the increase in the advocacy for the norm in Uganda, as well as the rejection by the government. So in 2004, local groups began their actions to support the diffusion of the LGBT community rights in Uganda. They consolidated, different groups consolidated their efforts to promote more tolerance, more protection for those rights, for those individuals in Uganda. The government, over time, rejected those kinds of calls. It led to extensive and growing international pressure on the Ugandan government. And in 2009, the counteraction by the government itself and different opposition groups actually turned more dominant. So global groups which opposed the diffusion of those kinds of norms with the expansion of the norm in Uganda took action in 2009, framing the threat of providing protection and rights to gay people. Many of those groups which objected to those norms being diffused globally, as well as in the within Uganda, were actually anti-gay groups originating in the West, some of them from the United States. And those groups have focused their opposition for the diffusion of the norm on a prominent call for legal action against the protection of gay rights. So instead of norm diffusion, which should lead eventually for, in some cases, legal actions to protect members of the LGBT community, those opposition groups actually called to the adoption of legal actions against the protection of those rights. Within Uganda, this has led to a process which made the topic of LGBT rights and the norm of LGBT rights as much more salient. It gained more and more momentum when all those processes took place at the end of the previous decade, the 2010s, the 2000 and 2010. The process also included another event that a couple of events that provided more support and turned the issue into a lot more salient was a local ruling by Ugandan, by the courts in Uganda against the government and in favor of LGBT community activists, which were attacked by police. So all those kinds of events happening together turned the issue a lot more salient. It made the norm prominent in political debates. And a lot of public officials have criticized this progress, and they actually blamed international organizations such as the UN and some of its member organizations as advocating for the rights of LGBT people in Uganda. And one of the prominent government officials which opposed this entire process, his name is the gentleman that you see on the picture here. His name is James Buturu. I hope that I'm spelling or pronouncing his name properly. And his job, actually, he was the Minister of State for Ethics and Integrity. So he was one of the main officials that opposed this entire process. The next phase is, as part of this opposition, the threat was the norm or the diffusion of the norm within Uganda was framed as a national threat. That's one way to oppose that. The way that it was done by public official was by associating the norm with a colonial sentiment. And in that sense, once it's colonialism by external pressure to Uganda, that represents a national threat. So instead of viewing that as a moral issue, it was a national threat on the country's culture and on the country's identity. And that by itself justified the applications of different defensive measures. That's the way to construct the diffusion of the norm, to oppose the norm by constructing it as a threat and justifying actions, in this case, legal actions. So the immunization itself came as a formal bill, which was introduced in late 2009. That bill expanded the already existing criminalization of same-sex relations, and the expansion included the promotion of or recognition of such sexual relations in public institutions and other places. So it was not just the actual same-sex relations, but it was actually the promotion of those, which means the focus on the advocacy of those kinds of relationships, which again, the advocacy of different human rights for members of the LGBT community were opposed by this bill. it was approved by the Ugandan parliament in 2013 and signed into law by 2014. Some of the implications of that, it had practical implication in the sense of limiting the ability to have basic legal rights to members of the community, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. It also outlawed public funding as well as educational program in that sense. So that's some of the practical aspects of this law. There's some discussion in the paper about whether the incentives for the entire immunization process, which ended up with the Immunization Act, whether it is actually normative, which fits the discussion within the constructivist theory in this case, because many of the high-ranking officials of the Ugandan government are actually conservative Christians, so maybe that's part of this process. But in reality, what some of the evidence that the authors present and their main argument, this is that instead this is actually a political action. It was intended to increase the domestic support for the government and the president, which faced extensive accusations of corruptions from domestic actors as well as international actors. So the process of norm backlash, which ended up with the Immunization Act, was not based on normative arguments, was actually political in that sense. Finally, they raise one important argument that fit or try to fit this specific example into the theory of constructivism and how exactly is the entire thing that happened in Uganda actually fits into a constructivist type process. So according to their argument, the issue of LGBT rights was not actually heavily pushed by activists in Uganda before the counteraction by the government. Actually, instead, it was pushed by the global process of norm diffusion based on different actions of the transnational LGBT rights advocacy network. So the norms were pushed from transnational groups and not by local groups. And only then, when the government opposed that, that led also to domestic opposition to the government action and eventually to the entire process leading to the adoption of the rule. So that's one way in which they argue that this case fits within the context of a system theory and the constructivist theory. Okay, if you want to read a little bit more about constructivism, so this is some of the possibilities that you can go to. The first paper you have here by Alexander Wendt is one of the most famous papers when it comes to, one of the most famous studies when it comes to constructivism in the context of international relations. That's it. Just final reminder, I sent you on Tuesday night, I sent you the link to your second task, the second survey. I'll just remind you that you have to submit this task by Monday night, so don't forget about that. Other than that, I hope you have a safe and good weekend, and I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.